Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by Sidney Dekker. Sidney earned his PhD in Cognitive Systems Engineering from The Ohio State University, where he worked with advisors Professor David Woods and Dr. Charles Billings. Since his PhD, Sidney has gained worldwide acclaim for his groundbreaking work on human error and safety. He was previously at Lund University in Sweden as professor, where he founded the Leonardo da Vinci Laboratory for Complexity and Systems Thinking, as well as the Masters in Science in Human Factors and System Safety. He has also been a senior fellow at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and honorary professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine, Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He has also been a visiting professor of community health science at the Faculty of Medicine, University of Manitoba in Canada. Sidney is an expert in risk mitigation and safety in large organizations, and more broadly, a thought leader in complexity theory. He kind of expounds upon some of the themes we've talked about in some of the previous episodes of the podcast, but in way more detail. So I think you're all going to enjoy Sidney's perspective very much. Sidney, thanks so much for joining us. You're the first person that I've spoken to on the podcast here that's a day ahead of me. So we're technically talking to each other on different days, which is pretty cool. You're in Australia and I'm here in the United States. So I wanted to begin by asking you, you've written pretty extensively and spoken extensively about sort of complexity theory and the limitations of reductionism and the sort of the broken part model. So just for people who aren't familiar with your work, you write a lot about safety. So for example, in aviation and medicine, and you try to figure out why or what are the underlying reasons for, if there are underlying reasons for some of these catastrophic safety failures. And you're very critical of the idea of, for example, in an airline safety incident, of trying to, or focusing solely on the broken part. So if a plane crashes and they're able to attribute some kind of a mechanical failure in the form of a broken part, you don't necessarily say that it's not worth trying to fix that broken part, but you also recognize that that broken part can be emblematic of some cultural and systematic failures. Same thing in medicine, right? You allude to the example in your book of the nurse who gives the wrong medication and kills somebody unnecessarily, but how sometimes even that, we always like to find simple cause and effect things for complex problems, but maybe that nurse did make a mistake, but sometimes it's because the organization took shortcuts and sort of a series of events led to or influenced that particular bad decision to be made. So I guess in short, how do you, what's sort of a better way of looking at these complex problems? And I guess a different way of asking that question is, what's your beef with Isaac Newton?
Well, thank you for that question, Doug. I suppose answering the question about beef with Isaac Newton will underlie everything I might say right now. But in a sense, I think, Doug, what we have to realize is that when people look for a cause that they can target, remove, eliminate, punish, sanction, change, redesign, then that in itself is not necessarily a bad reflex or an immoral way of going about responding to failure. And it's perhaps deeply human, right? We always seek agency. We seek the nucleus. We seek the kernel of where it all started. And if we can put our finger on that, it gives us something to do. It gives us something to fix. And particularly if you're an engineer, and probably many of your listeners are or have an engineering bent, you don't want to fix something, or a surgeon want to fix something, that's a delightful way to attack a problem. I think it comes very, very naturally to who and what we are. The issue, and you've already flagged that, is that in our pursuit of these fixes for the problems that we see, whether it's an airline crash or a space shuttle blowing up or a patient getting a medication misadministration, in our pursuit of fixing these issues, we very quickly and easily and quite often unwittingly I was going to use the word ignore, but that's impugning too much. But we don't pay as much attention to the sheer complexity that gives rise to these events. But of course, then the question is, well, what does that mean? I mean, how do you mean complex? Of course, they're complex. A hospital is complex. An airline is complex. And what I've been trying to do in at least one of my books is to say, well, complexity, and I'm not alone in that. I mean, complexity can be understood quite rigorously. There's complexity theory, right? And in fact, various angles on it and streams of complexity theory that help us understand how complex interactions give rise to successes and failures at the same time, well, or at least produced by the same system. And the constant message that you see when you start to understand complexity and complexity theory is that accidents and bad events aren't caused by single components. They're caused by interactions between lots of components. And so just fixing one broken part may make us feel good, may make us have the illusion that we fixed the problem, may give us the idea that we can sleep tight and wake up in a safer world tomorrow. But if the complexity and interactions in the system that produced the outcome are what they were before, then we have no assurances or guarantees whatsoever.
Got it. And then this is kind of more of an abstract question, but one of the criticisms of the complexity argument is that, okay, yes, reductionism has limitations, and in my field, and this is more of a medical audience, so this analogy will resonate with them a little bit more. There's this huge push for what's called evidence-based medicine. So the idea that people shouldn't just do things based on experience and whatever when whimsical type ideas, but that any kind of medical intervention should have some kind of legitimate empirical data to support it. Now, the scientific method, sort of, in order for it to maintain for a question to be sort of robust, you have to eliminate the influence of context and other variables on the particular thing that you're trying to study. Now, that obviously means that whenever you take these studies, their transfer or their applicability to clinical medicine necessarily becomes a little bit more limited. And then it's up to the individual practitioner to take all these isolated pieces of information that are robust from a scientific standpoint, but may not be that robust clinically, and then try to, navigate that gray area and the interaction between all those variables. But the problem is, those isolated dots on the map aren't necessarily that telling. But then if you take the reverse argument, you could, in a complex system, if you say everything matters, then everything matters to the point that nothing matters. And you see people who are overly critical of the evidence-based movement and overly critical of reductionism who kind of say, well, because everything matters, they come up with these outlandish ideas, and they have no data to support what they're doing except that it's purely based on intuition and not necessarily even the best logic. So I guess my question is, in these complex systems, where do we draw boundaries so we're not just going to the other extreme and saying, well, everything matters to the point that nothing does, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I understand. It's a very good question, a very good point. I think the issue is much larger than just understanding either evidence-based medicine or accidents, or I think in the history of humanity and in how we try to govern our parts of the world, Doug, you see this constant push-pull. On the one hand, a commitment to standardizing and centralizing, protocolizing solutions. On the other hand, a devolution, a pushing back down to expertise, almost a commitment to complexity, to understanding that not every problem shows up the same way twice. There are unique features to everything we encounter, and I don't think that either position can ever claim the epistemological privilege, right? That they have the answers that will deal with all our woes. I think the humility that we should be calling for is the understanding that every position in this makes analytic sacrifices, right? Whatever you do, whatever perspective you take, it's going to make some things visible and it's going to make some things invisible. I think what distinguishes more sophisticated thinking from less sophisticated thinking in this is not necessarily although, yeah, a little bit, the ability to switch perspectives and say, well, we could look at it this way, we could look at it this way. But particularly the realization that by taking a certain perspective, you obscure some things and make other things highly visible. And that awareness, I think, helps drive debate in much more constructive and helpful directions. Now, if we apply that first to complexity theory versus reductionist ideas of how things go right and wrong, and then perhaps to the example of evidence-based medicine, although that's a political minefield to wade into, obviously, but that you mentioned, let's do complexity theory and reductionism first. As you've intimated, and as I've one of my degrees is in engineering, so I certainly feel pulled toward that idea that let's go down and in and find the part that played up and fix it or change it, re-educate it, and make sure it doesn't contribute to this sort of outcome again. On the other hand, I feel constantly pulled toward the understanding that the outcome of a system is never produced just by one part. Otherwise, why have the system? There's other things involved in producing that outcome, which means we have to understand the interactions between that part and lots of other parts. And that's the call of complexity theory, right? It comes from interactions, not parts. You cannot reduce the behavior of the system to the behavior of only one of its parts. If you do that, you will drastically, dramatically, and tragically oversimplify, right? And I think that's generally a very good thing to keep in mind. Now, as you then, and I think you correctly said, if you take that commitment and say, all right, we can't reduce the behavior of the system to the behavior of one single part and tell that part to behave differently, and then the whole system will behave differently because of the complex interactions, it doesn't work that way, then it's still a justified question to say, well, where do we put the fence, right? If everything is responsible for producing the outcome, nothing is responsible for producing the outcome. And so where do we begin? Where do we end? Those are legitimate procedural and epistemological questions to raise. The answer from complexity theory immediately is there is no neutral arbiter in this. There is no one who can hover above the complex system and say, oh, this is part of our consideration and this isn't, because I say it is. The reason for that is if there is an arbiter that understands the complex system in its whole, then the system wouldn't be complex, right? Because you cannot have one agent in or around a system understand the whole complex system. Again, otherwise it wouldn't be a complex system, it would be a simple system. And so as soon as we start putting fences around things, and I agree, we have to do that as a matter of resource usage, as a matter of where we direct the investigation for what went wrong, where we direct policy or governance initiatives, where we change rules or think about personnel changes. We have to put fences around it. We can't do everything, right? Again, I think the realization that I would plead for is the adoption of the humility to understand that we are the ones who put those fences around them, and we put those fences around what we consider to be part of our problem and solution space on the basis of certain criteria. Very often, we don't even think about those, right? We simply take for granted that where we put the fences is where everybody would put them, or that makes natural sense, or it's some regulatory given or inspired or driven protocol that we're following. Let me just give one brief example, and then we'll dig back out of this huge hole that I'm digging here. Which is Congress, right, in the U.S. has mandated the National Transportation Safety Board to find the probable cause for accidents that they study. Quite surprisingly, well, or perhaps not so anymore, but the U.S. is one of the last industrial countries to actually have made that commitment in legislation. Because it is a profoundly Newtonian commitment. It is a commitment to understanding that there is one cause, one probable cause, one root cause, right? And you've seen that being negotiated with, we can put in contributing factors and other things, but there's still one probable cause. Many investigation authorities around the world have seen post-Newtonian light, and they don't even worry about stating the probable cause anymore. They may have some how should I put this? Some more, some less committed words like statements as to cause. I think the Canadians use that, right? The TSB, or something to that effect. Other investigation bodies don't even worry about this and just say, guys, we don't care about the cause. What we really want to find out is how to fix this, right? And so let's have that discussion in our report. So these are the recommendations, and now what are the accountabilities related to those recommendations? And so, again, I think if you grow up in a system that investigates accidents in the hunt for the probable cause, the fences that you put around the problem you investigate are really tight and tiny, and because that's what you've been taught and told to do. But it doesn't mean that it's natural, or it doesn't mean that it is lawful necessarily, other than within that particular piece of legislation. There are other ways to think about it, and it is that flexibility of mind that I would be calling for. Now, I'm so sorry for all of this, Doug, but back to evidence-based medicine and that idea, and to the original play that I had on the constant push-pull between centralizing versus decentralizing, or deferring to standardization and protocolization versus deferring to contextualized expertise. I don't think we can resolve that push-pull ever in any system of governance, right? It's always going to exist, and we may flop and flay from one to another a little bit more or less depending on political winds and other influences. But when you take that to evidence-based medicine, I think many clinicians would immediately say that, yes, it is stupid for relatively closed and repetitive problems not to define certain protocols and ways of attacking them, airway, breathing, circulation. I mean, ABC. I mean, it's stupid probably not to apply that sort of thing or think about where it applies and where it doesn't apply. Once you've figured out that that's a pretty good way to deal with the first response. But that, again, that's a repetitive problem that's relatively context insensitive, and I'm probably overstepping all kinds of lines here already, but you could make that argument, let me put it that way. At the same time, I think many clinicians would say, but that same governance response to say we need to protocolize and standardize and base it on evidence is much more negotiable in areas of novelty, in areas of deep complexity. And I think we see that more and more, right? That patients present not just with a single illness, they present with a whole panoply of issues that are not just medical, they are psychosocial, they are socioeconomic, right? And they're deeply embedded in the communities from which these people stem. And so the presentation of a patient nowadays gets, at least if you know what to look for, is immensely broad, and rather than just going down and in and fixing that particular part, oh, your sugar level is a bit high or low, oh, let's fix that, no, I mean, you have to think up and out, not just down and in, but up and out, right? This links, this particular issue that you think you can fix in that one visit, links to a vast amount of other things that, yes, some you might have control over, some you might not have control over. And so I think the notion of protocolized, standardized, evidence-based medicine becomes much more difficult to maintain in situations like, or at least it becomes easier to have an argument against it there. And finally, of course, but I say that from a position of science itself, is that when you make claims about evidence-based, then people automatically assume that the notion of evidence is unproblematic, right? That it has been, right? That it has been decided, that somebody or some lord has decided, oh, this counts as evidence and this doesn't count as evidence. As Steve Jobs said, you got to quote Steve Jobs at some point in a podcast, right? This is all stuff that people made up, right? Evidence is stuff that people make up, and they call something evidence and decide not to call something else evidence. These are all negotiable categories. And when you look at it critically, and the literature is, the literature against evidence-based medicine is at least as vociferous as the evidence, as the literature for. And it would immediately make the most central claim, which is evidence-based medicine has an incredibly difficult time producing evidence for itself. And so I'll leave it at that.
No, I think that's great. And the word that I kept hearing over and over again was humility. So I think humility speaks to the fact that in these complex systems, even the experts have to embrace some degree of uncertainty. And I think that part of the reason why it's so easy to oversimplify these complex processes and look for a singular cause is because it makes us feel good. Like, oh, we have control over this situation now. We found the cause, but it's kind of, it creates the illusion of safety and resolution when in fact you're just basically deluding yourself. So how important do you think it is to kind of embrace that uncertainty, even though it might not be satisfying? Because you look at all the stuff that's happening now, whether it's, the passenger on the United flight here in the United States, everyone's got an opinion on why that happened and like United's bad. And I'm looking at it like that could have happened on any airline if you know what goes on in the airline industry. And then, your favorite candidate loses the election. Everyone's got an opinion on why exactly that happened. Or, an innocent person gets physically assaulted by the police, and there's always a singular cause. So how much do we need to go back to, and say, we don't really know? And then do you think it actually improves safety and the ability to mitigate risk when we're less sure of ourselves?
That's a beautiful question. To answer the latter part of that, yes, absolutely. A constant humility in the face of complexity is I think the only way to deal with it meaningfully and respectfully and ultimately productively. That is not to say that I am insensitive to or don't understand that. There is sometimes not only political advantage or societal advantage or necessity, perhaps even, to suggest that we have some certainty, right? We, unless something else comes out, we really believe that we should be looking at these parts or these things or these factors in order for this thing not to happen again. And we shouldn't underestimate for a moment the amount of that's going on in official investigations into accidents and incidents, right? That in part it is about assuaging, in part it is about putting concerns to bed, in part it is about reassuring the industrial base of a country that, all is well, keep producing these things, it's all good, right? We found out, we zeroed in on it, don't worry about it, keep going. And the consumer base that makes use of these things. Now, I think what you pointed to as well, Doug, in that perhaps, I think the debate is still very open on that. The vast democratization of access to both data, ideas, opinions, particularly opinions, through the proliferation and explosion of social media, has made the instability of explanations much more evident, right? But rather than, so let me explain what I mean by the instability of explanations, as it will. The passenger issue you just mentioned, right? Could be caused by this, could be caused by that, could be just one bad cop, or, on the other hand, you could say, or one bad airline policy, or you could say, no, hang on, this is actually a really one of the outcroppings of an incredibly complex and long brewing phenomenon, right? That has lots of interactions and long path dependency, going back into political decisions, certain tendencies toward a neo-racism. I mean, all of that, right? And you could make an argument, and probably a plausible argument that explains an event like that on the basis of that. And as soon as you do that, you will get lots of other opinions that say, oh, God, no, it's only this, or it's that, or it's this factor, it's just these guys, right? Or it's just this airline, or this airplane, or that policy. And so there is a liberty, a democracy, an openness to the provision of all of these opinions about why these things happen and go right or wrong. What I see is societally is not necessarily that creates greater trust in the people who offer these opinions, and that even those who were previously held to have positions of authority to speak about these things no longer get trusted the same way that they once did. And they probably have themselves to thank for it, in part. And Doug, I value your ideas on this, but I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure myself. I mean, it's kind of like a microcosm for the whole social media thing. 90% of the time when I go on social media, I'm like, I need to stop wasting my time and get off here and stop reading some of these ridiculous things. But then every now and then, because of all that access to information, people do say things that are insightful and that change the way you think, and it might spark something that kind of advances you as a professional. So I think you've got to take the good with the bad. And like you said, there's no real arbiter, and there never will be, to decide what's good information and what's bad, or where should we draw boundaries in a complex system versus where we shouldn't. That person or that thing, that being doesn't exist. So I think, like you said, we have to be having conversations, and some conversations aren't as worthwhile as others, but I think having those conversations is useful.
Doug, even that you decide on the basis of a particular criterion, right? You think they're not worthwhile. Other people may think they're worthwhile because they have a different background, a different set of criteria that they import into that judgment, right? So, and that raises, I think, a very interesting question based on what you just said, and but I'm not asking you questions, which is, given that reality on all these opinions on why things go right and wrong, and the openness and access to them, clearly, there is more noise, right? Lots of more noise. But is there also more signal? Because you just said that, you might find some pearls or some interesting things among all the noise that really represent signal. Has the noise to signal ratio worsened, improved, stayed the same? Yeah, we're creating more noise, but we're also creating more signals? How do you look at that?
It could be. I think that sometimes even to be exposed to something that you don't think is a good idea can actually help influence your decision making and solidify certain thought processes. So again, there's more noise, but even that noise, where do you draw the line even between noise and signal? Because that noise, I mean, and again, I get to ask you the impossible questions to answer. No, but seriously, I think you've hit on it. Like, we don't really know. And I want to, because I purposely do this where I try to find people who are subject matter experts, and I ask these really abstract questions because I think it's interesting. And I could have somebody who's, an expert in a different field who might say something totally different, and both perspectives are valuable because, again, we don't have an arbiter. But I'm going to make things a little bit easier and get kind of more into some concrete things that are a little bit easier to talk about and more tangible. And so I wanted to segue into, you've done a lot of research and work into safety, and you talk a lot about, there are certain things that are important to measure from a safety standpoint or a risk mitigation standpoint, and certain things that aren't as valuable. We live in an age where we're obsessed with measuring things and data to the point that, again, if you measure everything, then nothing really matters. So when it comes to safety and risk mitigation, what do you think it is that's actually important to measure? And what are the things that actually are counterproductive to measure that might lead an organization astray when it comes to maximizing safety?
Yeah, good. Right, and the last question you asked, you could even broaden that out and not just ask what is counterproductive to measure,
right? But
actually say, is it counterproductive to measure at all, right? And so the example I'd like to use to just illustrate my willingness to engage with that last question is talking to an emergency room nurse not long ago, and I asked her, that typical question that is often a hugely revelatory question. I said, what's the stupidest thing you got to do here to work here every day? Right? What's the stupidest thing? And she didn't skip a beat. Right? Didn't hesitate a second. She said, the stupidest thing I have to do every day is to report metadata up the hierarchy. And I'm going, metadata, to help me understand metadata, right? And so she says, just incident numbers, right? How many needle sticks, how many this, how many misadministrations, how many, and just the number. It's just the number that goes up the line. Because it then, enters into some Excel sheet or PowerPoint presentation for some leadership group, which then has to decide how to do some management or leadership on it, which is, of course, nonsensical because it's just a number. With no context, no explanation, no story, right? And so I think that's one of those areas in which the sheer measurement of these things itself becomes almost destructive to the organizational conversation about risk. Because there's no real conversation, right? There are no stories. There is nothing going up the line that actually helps illustrate the complexities and context from which these things arise. All that happens is that a bureaucratic accountability requirement is met, right? We sent the numbers up, we presented the numbers, we talked about them in the monthly meeting. Let's move on. No, the coffee is getting cold. And then we'll wait until next month. That's where measurement becomes irrelevant to the point of being destructive to the organizational conversation. Now, I think the more informed parts of the literature on this would say, but this is of course in severe summary, that what you measure in terms of safety and risk depends very much on your beliefs about safety and risk and what you think you want to prevent. And this, I think, critically, is where many industries have drifted into a practice that is not very productive. You look at Macondo, Deepwater Horizon, which is, of course, a poster child for the argument that many people would have in this to say, measuring the number of times that people are carrying coffee in a cup without a lid, or measuring the number of times that they're not holding the handrail, is absolutely not predictive of a well blowout, right? It doesn't say anything about the risk bubbling under your feet as you try to be good Boy Scouts on that rig. Yet we measure what's visible, we measure what's easy, we measure what is in fact measurable and countable, but it's not what counts. What counts is understanding how risk gets created in these deeply complex engineering processes. And that ultimately is what we have to manage, because the 11 guys who died there have no benefit from ever having held a handrail or a lid on their coffee cups, right? They're dead. And that's not because of those other things we were measuring. And so I think that's, I had a conversation with the construction industry yesterday, right? And there's lots of talk about measuring back sprains and musculoskeletal disorders, because it impacts the working population, creates lots of often socialized costs, right, depending on the governance structure of the country in which it happens. But then when you look at the construction industry worldwide, it creates some of the most fatalities of all industries, right? And so, but managing back sprains and rolled ankles really doesn't do, or measuring that, doesn't do anything to prevent fatalities, right? You have to start thinking very differently about what to measure. And when you look at, and that'll be, then we can move on, but I think this is in part the idea underneath what resilient engineering and Eric Hollnagel and colleagues like that on safety 1, safety 2, or safety differently, as I've called it, would like to propose and promote, which is instead of measuring the numbers of negatives to the point that safety is equated to the absence of those negatives, right? The safety is, which is really strange, right? It's there when nothing is there, right? Which is a really wacky way to try to understand a phenomenon. But safety as an absence of negatives tends to lead to practices that incentivize behaviors that are ultimately counterproductive and in fact destructive to safety. What I mean by that is talking to a case manager in another industry, oil and gas, not long ago, and she said to me that she had to pull out of working with one organization because she was so disgusted by the way in which they made sure that she was pressurized to call injuries and incidents something else so as to end up with a different measurement at the end of the month. Right? So let's not suture this wound, even though it calls for it medically, but let's tape it because that allows me to categorize it differently and less severely, and then our numbers look better, right? And so the measurement stops being a measurement, right? It becomes a target. It becomes something you want to achieve. It becomes something that you then direct organizational resources and incentives toward in order to reach that target. But it means that ultimately the suffering that is underneath the production of that number, because somebody still got hurt, somebody still has a wound that would actually need suturing, that goes almost unacknowledged. It goes actively denied. As in, oh, no, it's not that bad. You're not suffering that badly, right? We'll just tape it. I think that's deeply inhumane. And ultimately, I think it's stupid, right? You can relate these, and that's part of the point of the book, Drifted to Failure, certainly Safety Differently. You could relate the infatuation with measuring safety that way directly to our ignorance about the bigger process risks building up underneath our complex systems, which is why, and then I will really try to put a full stop behind this, which is why we try to promote the idea that we need to understand not what goes wrong, but what goes right. We need to measure the things that go well. We need to measure the positive capacities inside of these organizations rather than measuring the occasional negatives, because measuring positive capacities gives us a much better handle on what is present in an organization to make sure that the variance, the risks, the surprises, the difficulties are dealt with well.
Yeah, and one of the things that you've spoken extensively about is how sometimes measuring the wrong things or focusing on the things that can go wrong leads to a culture of risk aversion that in the short term might produce some really good outcomes in the form of the fact that you've had no negative incidences. So, for example, in these risk-averse cultures, an organization might go 10 or so years without a serious safety incident, but you said sometimes that kind of success, if you want to call it that, can actually lead to more catastrophic failures down the road. So can you elaborate on a little bit the relationship between that risk aversion and how sometimes success can be very deceiving and kind of lure people into complacency?
Yeah, although I hate that word, as you know, because it's way too componential and motivational, right?
Sure.
Complacency is just it's a problem of individuals, and we need to engage in behavior modification or declare a war on error and complacency, and then we can deal with that, right? Which is, I think, childish, infantile, silly, and not very helpful. But let me give you an example. So we're working with a healthcare system in some unnamed country. Well, it was named at the time, but it still is named. And what they were showing us that about 1 in 13 care encounters, something goes wrong, right? So there's some problem. And I mean, you and I, having worked in aviation, we go, oh my word, 1 in 13, good Lord, that's really, really scary. And probably some people who work inside of healthcare go, that's pretty good compared to what, and so, again, these, and, as soon as you start counting and measuring things, something is in, something is out, which is a judgment, right? What do you mean things going wrong? Is it a misadministration that was caught? Is it one that actually led to consequences or could have led to consequences? And so there's an enormous amount of human judgment and decision making that goes into the production of such a number. But let's leave that particular complexity and social aspect of it on the shelf for the moment, and just take the number 1 in 13 for granted for the moment. What we saw and had great conversations about with their safety group, which they did have, was that essentially all of the resources that these guys had to spend on safety went into understanding that 1 in 13. Why did it go wrong? What do we do now? What's the post conditions? What's the aftermath? Right, and all of the resources, intellectual, financial, time, all went into understanding 1 in 13. And then I raised the question, and Eric Holnagel would certainly have done the same. Do you even know why the other 12 go well? And they were silent and said, no. No, we have no idea why they go well. Right? So what distinguishes one that goes wrong from the 12 that go well? And so when we started looking at and these were really well-informed people, right? These weren't the people who would say, oh, it's complacency, or somebody lost situation awareness, or simple labels for human error all over again, right? These were really quite sophisticated people. And well-read. What they found in the one that went wrong was miscalculations, guidelines not followed. communication issues, procedural violations. Right? That's the stuff that they found in the cases that went wrong. Once again, we then asked, well, what about the cases that go right? We started looking at that too, which, if it's 1 in 13, that's a pretty good base rate. So you can actually spend some time in a hospital in various places and try to understand how things go right. There's ways to study this and to set it up in a way that creates evidence. But we'll leave that word for what it was based on the previous discussion. And Doug, what we found was that in all the 12 cases where things go right, what happens? There's miscalculations. There's guidelines not being followed. There's communication failures and issues. There's procedural violations. Right? There's people not following the protocol. That doesn't distinguish success from failure. And this is quite an interesting revelation. Right? That Ernst Mach said the same in 1905. Right? That the sources of failure and success are eerily close to each other. Right? And as Lincoln said, half a century before, it's only the outcome that can distinguish one from the other, right? Well, in fact, Ernst Mach pretty much said that too. But and so these ingredients are always there. So what is it that distinguishes failure from success? What distinguishes that one from the other 12? We did some more work. And this is, of course, consistent with stuff that Dave Woods has been finding in space operations in the 90s, and the high reliability guys are finding in various other organizations. But what distinguishes the one that goes wrong from the 12 that go right is the presence of positive capacities. And that might include the ability to stop in the face of acute production pressure that says, no, we got to go on. An ability to say stop, which is institutionally ratified, which is institutionally legitimated. In aviation, again, you've worked in that. You know very well that there's all kinds of stopping rules that will officially have you backed up by the command chain, right? If you say we're going around, officially nobody can nail you for that afterwards, because if they would, that would quickly put an end to go-arounds, right? And so they understand that you need to be able to call stop to production. Now, in practice, it's not as neat and nice and easy as that, because very often, even up a command chain, there may be severe pressures to continue production. And you will get singled out for stopping it at that time, which tends to send a chill down the spine of your colleagues, and I've seen that happen. You probably have as well. But ensuring that ability to say stop. I had a conversation with a chief pilot in northern Norway once, and in Norway, and so he was talking about the flying that these guys were doing in northern Norway, which is pretty bad weather, lots of snow, high winds, very difficult terrain, low visibility, all of the things we love, right? And so, and he was struggling with the problem that when the captain was flying, the co-pilot very often didn't call for a go-around, even though the conditions merited it. And how could he change that? Were they complacent? I actually didn't ask that question, but it's there to be asked. And what I suggested was to make sure that a first officer that did make a go-around when the captain was flying, right, that the first officer initiates the go-around, right, so the guy lower in command initiates a go-around. And you can project this onto a surgical situation, right, where the attending gets told by the resident or an intern, this is not a good idea. That's the common bile duct, whatever. That they somehow get rewarded, and visibly so in the organization. Bunch of flowers, bottle of whiskey, or whatever it takes, and make sure that the rest of the organization knows that you, as the command, have the back of these guys, particularly lower down the ranks, who are able to say, stop, this is not a good idea, right? And this goes all the way back. These are not new ideas, Doug. Even My Lai, right? Some of the guys who were in fact outside of that particular unit, and perhaps lower in rank, try to stop some of that massacre, right? And so this is how we stop terrible things from taking place, because they simply become normalized to the people who are inside that particular problem. So it's that sort of presence of a positive capacity, this legitimated and institutionally confirmed ability to say, stop, no, don't go on. Other aspects of that we found in teams that refuse to take past success as a guarantee of future safety, right? Who say, well, the fact that this went well yesterday means nothing today, right? Because the conditions are different, the patient is different, the physiology and anatomy is different, right? Evidence-based medicine or no, right? It's still different. We saw this, and Dave Woods plucked this out back in the 90s, that and again, this is consistent with high reliability theory as well, and what those guys have discovered is that if you increase the diversity of opinion and actively encourage dissenting opinion in teams, then the probability of things going wrong goes down. Right, Irving Janis started with that, of course, in groupthink back in the 70s, right, the Bay of Pigs, and reflecting on those policy disasters. And so he clearly also found that if you have a diversity of opinion and actively encourage dissent inside of these groups that otherwise start breathing their own air, that's the presence of a positive capacity that distinguishes failure from success. And finally, another one that we just found, and again, this would be quite intuitive for you coming from aviation, groups, teams, crews that are able to keep a discussion about risk alive, even when everything looks safe, tend to create safer outcomes. You do this in briefings, you do this in debriefings, you do this in pre-op little conversations before you cut into the patient, right? And so even though everything looks normal, completely normal, patient with absolutely no complications, still have a discussion about the procedure, what you're going to do with the choreography around it, do the briefing, keep that discussion about risk alive even when everything looks safe. It is those sorts of capacities, Doug, that we found make the difference between failure and success. It is not these negatives, whether people miscommunicate, miscalculate, violate procedures, don't follow the protocol. Those are all decoys, right? Because it happens all the time. Otherwise, they don't get work done, right? It's that simple. You don't get work done if you don't do that. Follow all the rules. Well, what would you like to do? Follow all the rules or fly the jet? You know, and that really was sort of the question in many situations. And so, what distinguishes it is the presence of those positive capacities. That's what we have to develop, I think, both in practice and in literature, to understand, to measure, to not audit, because that would probably kill it right there, but to at least understand.
That was great. I mean, it was very insightful and also very concrete. And you brought up the way that you sort of internalized the word complacency. Obviously, I want to elaborate on that a little bit, because you've been very outspoken about the pitfalls of the blame culture, not only from the standpoint that it's judgmental and somewhat dehumanizing, but also that it actually can make conditions less safe. So is there a line between, okay, we want to try to avoid this blame culture because it's not productive for a variety of reasons, and then is there a way to do that and also maintain individual accountability, or do you not even think in those terms as accountability, a word like complacency, where you're like, I don't even think in those terms, it just doesn't even make sense for me to do it?
That's a good question. No, I think for me, complacency and accountability rank very differently. Complacency, well, never mind complacency. I've written enough about.
We're done with complacency.
Let's talk about accountability.
Yeah.
I think institutionally, organizationally, socially, it is an important concept that we cannot avoid. The reason being is that as long as we're social beings, and we always have been, and I believe we always will be, we have no choice but to be accountable to other people about what we do and why we do it. Otherwise, if you don't have that, there is no basis for any social order. There is no basis for collaboration, cooperation, trust, investment in a future together, doing another operation together, having another flight together. If you don't want to be accountable, you cannot be accountable. There is no possibility for that. And of course, we've got it deeply embedded in leadership structures and job descriptions and everything, as well as a complete legal system. Again, what I think we need to do, Doug, is the same we did for evidence, right? The notion of evidence is to critique, ask very critically, what does accountability mean? And who gets to say? So I've been in the last edition of the Just Culture book. I think it came out last year. Yeah. I've tried to distinguish, and the line doesn't go that clearly between them, but distinguish between retributive notions of accountability and restorative notions of accountability. And retributive notions are quite common and well known, and they essentially hold people accountable by asking three questions, which is, what rule was broken? How bad was that? And thus, what should the consequences be? Right? So you look back on whatever rule or norm or standard was broken. You say, how bad was that? Well, have they done it before, right? Or was it intentional, or was it unintentional? And you start to sort of say, well, it's gray, it's white, it's not as bad, it's bad. Right? And there's a whole lore and books and consultancy in the U.S. based on that very idea. And I'm not saying it's bad to categorize or even reflect over this, but it's limited to just keep your thinking restricted to that alone. And on the basis of how bad that violation was, you append particular consequences to it. You fire them, you jail them, you give them a warning, slap on the fingers, you shrug, whatever, right? And so now Ginny Sharp, who's written a bunch of on accountability in healthcare, she would call that backward-looking accountability. It looks back on the event. It looks back on what has already happened. It looks back on water under the bridge. It looks back on the event that has passed. The alternative is obviously not a retributive system of accountability, but a restorative system of accountability. It asks three very different questions. And the first question is, who is hurt? And the second question is, what do they need? And the third question is, whose obligation is it to meet that need? And that creates a very different conversation. It creates a conversation not just between some authority and the supposed offender. It creates a conversation among the whole community involved and affected by the event. Patients, families, doctors, colleagues, medical students, interns, other staff. And the accountability that this creates is, again, to use Ginny Sharp's word, is forward-looking. Rather than looking back on the event, it looks forward to what we do now. If you have a conversation about hurts, needs, and obligations, right? Who's hurt? What do they need? Whose obligation is it to do something about that? That's a forward-looking conversation. It's a conversation about redressing a need. It's a conversation about assigning accountability to people to go fix something about that, right? And say, okay, 4 months from now, you need to make sure that this thing is in place in order to give us the confidence, or the family the confidence, that this won't happen again, or whatever compensations or redress may be necessary. It's a very different conversation. Now, lest anybody would think that this is a naive and overly humane or philanthropic way to think about accountability, recognize that we've been using, as humanity, these systems of restorative accountability since we've got written records, and perhaps even before. Children do it spontaneously, right? Studies in Denmark have shown that. One kid steals a teddy bear for another kid, and then the retributive response would be for the kid who's been bereft of his teddy bear or her teddy bear to go beat up the kid who stole it, right? And so that would be a form of redress and accountability. I'm holding you accountable for stealing my teddy bear, baff, baff, right? And so a restorative system, and that seems to be more spontaneously introduced by kids themselves, is both easier and as I said, more common. Who's hurt? Well, the kid whose bear was stolen. Well, what do they need? Well, they want their bear back. Well, whose obligation is it to give the bear back? Boom, done. Conversation over, right? And then you might even invest in, what else do they need? Well, they need some reassurance that it won't get stolen in the next 30 seconds again, right? And so then you make some arrangements around that, and you offer some trust, and accountability that way. But it's forward-looking accountability. It's accountability that is oriented into the future. And whole countries do this, right? South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they have essentially run on the logic of a restorative system. Who's hurt? What do they need? Whose obligation is it to meet that need? To me, Doug, that gives me enormous confidence in the resilience of the human spirit, that we are able to think differently and more humanely about accountability.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way. I know we're coming up on an hour to end this. Before I let you go, because we've only really scratched the surface on a lot of these concepts, and you've written about them and spoken about them in way more detail. Before you go, where can people learn more about some of the work that you've done, or what online resources do you want to point people to get more of this information?
Yeah, right. So my website would be the easiest, and it's sidneydekker.com, and just spell it correctly. That would help. Which is Sidney Dekker is SidneyDekker.com. So no dot between Sidney and Dekker. SidneyDekker.com. And I've got a bunch of course, there's links to all the books that I've written there. There's links to, which may also be interesting, links to a bunch of lectures. I got a short course on just culture on there that are it's free for people to use, and it has been used very widely and extensively already, both in healthcare and other domains. And so I'm very happy for people to use it. The more people talk about this stuff, Doug, I think the happier we might all be, because it's ultimately an encouragement, as you indicated, to think perhaps more humanely, more differently. About who we are as humans in relation to each other. I want to leave a story of inspiration and hope at the end of the day.